remains that even if we were to bring emissions to a halt right now, the globe would continue to warm up, probably by another degree Fahrenheit, just in response to historical emissions in the past. And so that doesn't give us a lot of wiggle room. If we're trying to avoid 2 degrees Celsius warming relative to pre-industrial times, we've already warmed 1 of those degrees. There's another ½ degree Celsius, 1 degree Fahrenheit, ½ degree Celsius locked in. There isn't a whole lot of wiggle room left if we're going to avoid that 2 degree warming, and there is a long-term commitment. It will take centuries for that carbon to gradually come out of the atmosphere, be absorbed into other components of the climate system. And that's really why there's climate change to me is such an ethical issue, because the time frame, the time scale of the changes that we're putting in, that we're locking in now, ensures that generations will feel the impacts of the decisions we're making today.
And the blue in the back, I think I saw your hand.
There's another question back.
So if nature was not, if nature didn't have any cooling factors at all, then and we were still doing what we were doing, then it would be increasing even more, like double the rate.
Yeah, it's funny because often as climate scientists will be asked this question, how much of the warming is due to human activity? And many scientists will say, well, we're pretty sure that most of the warming is due to human activity. I actually think that's the wrong answer. I think that more than 100% of the warming is due to human activity, in the sense that the climate should have warmed even more than it did. And the only reason it didn't is because there was a natural cooling impact from volcanoes and solar output changes. So in fact, natural factors have been offsetting some of the warming influence of our increased greenhouse gas concentrations. And since those factors are cyclical, it means eventually it'll go in the other direction, and it may enhance the warming further. So in a very real sense, the climate should have warmed even more than it has, and we've been sort of lucky in that natural factors have offset that cooling. Also the effect of pollution, I alluded to, sulfate particles that we put into the atmosphere because of industrial activity, coal burning and other processes, that has had an offsetting cooling impact in some parts of the globe. And as we've cleaned up the atmosphere, for example, we passed the Clean Air Acts because we were destroying lakes upstate in New York and in New England. And when we started scrubbing those sulfate particles out of our industrial emissions, we actually took away some of the cooling that had masked global warming. And that's why you see the warming accelerate over the past few decades. It's in part because of the passage of measures to take away this offsetting cooling impact. So yes, not only has there been an offsetting human cooling impact, but there have been offsetting natural cooling impacts. And the fact is that we haven't seen as much warming as we would have otherwise. And that means, to some extent, we may have become a bit too complacent with regard to how much warming we really will get in the future.
George?
How much warmer can our oceans get before the food chain is disrupted?
But it's another great question. We know that the oceans in particular are being subject to multiple sort of insults. And it's just like us. If we have one thing that goes wrong in our day, we can deal with it. We have a couple of things that go wrong, we can deal with it. But if everything goes wrong, on a given day, it can really crush you. It can crush your spirits. And that's sort of what's happening with the oceans. We're subjecting them to the effects of global warming, but also we're acidifying the ocean by putting CO2 in the atmosphere that's getting absorbed into the oceans and leading to lower pH in the oceans. We are, of course, contaminating the oceans with chemical contaminants, runoff, industrial runoff, and we are overfishing the oceans as well. We're tampering with the food chain directly through our fishing practices. And so when you put all those things together, it really portends a pretty dire future if we don't take actions now to avert this course that we're on. So unfortunately, global warming is just one of the things that's impacting the health of the oceans, and it's all of these things coming together in sort of a perfect storm that I think is really why scientists who study the health of ocean ecosystems are so worried. And you know, the ocean acidification, for example, combined with global warming, is an even greater threat to coral reefs. And coral reefs, of course, are home to a large amount of ocean biodiversity. And some scientists have projected that if we continue to increase CO2, you know, along historical, we follow sort of business as usual with our CO2 emissions, that the combined effects of ocean acidification and global warming and coral bleaching that results from the warming of the waters will basically lead to the destruction of coral reefs within a few decades.
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned fossil fuels having an impact on this. What about America's massive livestock industry? Is that playing into it too, with having just an abundance of cows and chickens all like concentrated? Like, I don't really know too much about it, but I always hear it mixed in there.
Yeah, it is. You know, so there are multiple sources of greenhouse gas emissions. We tend to focus a lot on CO2 because it has a very long lifetime in the atmosphere. Once you put CO2 into the atmosphere, some of it is going to be there for centuries. But methane is also a potent greenhouse gas. In fact, it's an even more potent greenhouse gas, molecule for molecule, than CO2, although it exists at much smaller concentrations in the atmosphere than CO2. But the increase in methane has been, you know, one of the factors that has warmed the planet. It's one of the greenhouse gases that's contributed to the overall greenhouse warming of the planet. And so right now there's a lot of discussion about sort of trading off the risk of ongoing carbon emissions and other practices that, like livestock raising, like rice cultivation, like damming projects. The damming projects taking place, you know, in China, for example, are potentially producing large pools of standing water where methane-generating bacteria can breed, and that could actually contribute substantially to an increase in methane concentrations. We tend to focus mostly on the CO2 because of the time frame involved. Methane is really only in the atmosphere. Its residence time is on the scale of about 7 to 10 years. And so in the near term, it's a factor, but in the long term, it's really the CO2 that we worry about the most.
Dr. Mann, first I want to commend you for your work that you've done.
Thank you.
But I do have a question. This is based on an interview that you did at the Sustainable Operations Summit in New York.
Sure, yeah.
Which isn't quite as east as here. It's close. You said a large majority of climate scientists say the climate is shifting in ways that can cause serious impacts, and they cite that human release of greenhouse gases is a principal cause. But a tiny vocal minority of researchers contest that view. And you go on to say that it seems as though they're winning the battle.
Well, okay, so I don't think that's not, I'm not being quoted there. I think that's just you're reading from the article itself. But I don't know if you have a specific quote of mine.
Well, it's in quotation marks. In any event, you did say that there was a minority of skeptics. But in 1992, the Heidelberg Appeal was signed by more than 4,000 signatures, including 72 Nobel Prize winners from 106 different countries, who believe that anthropogenic man-made global warming is false. On top of that, I might add...
Well, I know other people are going to have questions too, so why don't I'll just tackle that one and then we can move on to make sure everybody has a... Okay,
why am I to believe that the symbiotic relationship between carbon dioxide and oxygen, which is cellular respiration and photosynthesis, would not create an equalization of carbon dioxide?
Okay, so let me, I perceive there being sort of two questions worth addressing there, so I'll address both of them.
I got plenty of questions for you, sir.
So that's great. So the first question, often you hear about these various petitions. And in fact, we were just talking about this before my lecture. The most famous of them is the so-called Oregon petition. It was supposedly 30,000 scientists who disagreed with the consensus within the scientific community about human-caused climate change. And I should emphasize that there is a consensus. You know, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, which was founded in the 19th century by Abraham Lincoln, Republican President Abraham Lincoln, to inform our government, to inform society about matters of science that have implications for policy. They are on record as agreeing with the consensus represented by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And in fact, the national academies of all the major industrial nations, all the G8 nations, are all on record as having, as agreeing with the fact that human-caused climate change is real and it represents a potential threat. But sometimes you'll hear this claim that, well, there are all these other scientists who disagree, and you know, the numbers vary. I think the claim is, with the Oregon petition, 30,000 scientists. And so I believe it was ABC News, or maybe it was Newsweek, I forget exactly. There were some investigative reporters who actually sort of dug into that a little bit, and they tried to figure out the identities of the various signatories. And they found that there were very few of them were actually scientists. The ones who were being called scientists were mostly like medical doctors, and many of them weren't even around anymore. A lot of them were deceased. And there were names like characters from the TV series MASH, and one of the Spice Girls was a signatory apparently on this petition. And when you actually try to figure out whether there were any scientists working in areas of science relevant to climate, you know, oceanography, atmospheric science, meteorology, there were essentially none of the signatories that fell into that category. So it's sort of, this is an old, it's an old tactic by those looking to discredit the findings, the mainstream findings of science, to point to these various sorts of petitions. And one of the organizations that's been behind these petitions, in fact, they put out another one just a few years ago that we both received. One of the organizations that has been sponsoring this stuff is called the Heartland Institute, and some of you may have read about them in the headlines recently. There have been a number of scandals associated with them. Most recently, they were putting up billboards in Chicago comparing climate scientists to the Unabomber, thank you, the Unabomber and Osama bin Laden, and it sort of backfired on them, needless to say, because I don't really think that Scott and I are all that much like Osama bin Laden or the Unabomber in the way we approach these issues. That's my response to this idea that, you know, there are these various petitions that conflict with the consensus views of the scientific community. Now, on the other part of your question on CO2, so there is a natural carbon cycle. You know, there is a balance, a long-term balance that exists between various components within the Earth system that produce CO2 and components that take in CO2. And there's been a long-term balance that's maintained CO2 concentrations for most of the past 12,000 years, somewhere between 180 and 280 parts per million. So you do see fluctuations with the coming and going of the ice ages, for example, and some of the processes that are involved. And so there are these natural fluctuations in CO2 levels over time. But if you actually look at those natural fluctuations and how they compare with the increase due to human input over the past century, it's off the scale. We have raised CO2 concentrations to levels that we're quite certain we haven't seen for at least 800,000 years, as far back as the ice core records go, and probably from other indirect lines of evidence, several million years. Now, if we continue on the course that we're on, with business as usual, and we get CO2 concentrations up to between 2 and 3 times their pre-industrial level, between about 550 and 720 parts per million in the atmosphere, we're quite certain that those levels will be unprecedented in tens of millions of years. What we're literally doing is we're taking all the carbon that nature buried over time scales of tens of millions of years since the time of the dinosaurs, and we're releasing it, not like nature does on time scales of tens of millions of years, but on time scales of tens of years, 1 million times faster. And the planet has just never had to adapt to changes in the atmosphere occurring on that time scale of that magnitude.
I actually have a question for you. I have a comment and a question. Just to put things in perspective, 30,000 scientists, which they weren't, but even if it were, sounds like a lot. It's 0.2% of the scientists on the planet. 0.2%. So that would be like going to brain surgeons. 99.8% of them tell you need to do this, but you're going to listen to the 0.2%. So maybe one finger on one of those brain surgeons tells you otherwise. So my question is, what other groups besides scientists that are certainly not leftist tree-hugging environmentalists also agree with the science and say there's a serious concern for the century?
That's a great question too, because there is this perception, and it's perpetuated in much of the public discourse that the concern over climate change is somehow a concern of the far left in our political spectrum. Although we've already seen some evidence in my talk that there have been prominent Republicans, for example, who have been quite passionate about the reality and the threat of climate change. But the Pentagon, their most recent quadrennial report described in some degree of detail the threat that climate change represents to our national security. Okay, so the national security community is very concerned about climate change. Hardly, part of the fringe left of our political system. The national security community is concerned because they know that they will have to contend with an open Arctic Ocean decades from now, and suddenly they'll have to defend a new coastline, and there will be questions over drilling rights, oil drilling rights in the Arctic. That's a whole new thing to worry about. They also know that climate change projections, projected impacts of climate change, tell us that we will see a decrease in fresh water resources in large parts of the world. We will see a decrease in food resources. One thing that isn't discussed nearly as much as it needs to be is the fact that in the tropics, even a little bit of warming, even another degree Celsius of warming will lead to a dramatic decrease in the productivity of cereal crops because they're sort of already growing at their peak, at their optimal temperature, and even a little bit of warming will lead to a very rapid and dramatic decrease in productivity of grains, cereal crops. And we're talking about a part of the world that's already struggling to meet, in many cases, their food needs, and they're going to have even less available. And national security experts who study their history know that, in the past, increased competition for natural resources has always led to conflict. And so there's a reason that in some of the descriptions that national security experts depict of what a climate change future could look like, it's almost indistinguishable from some of the post-apocalyptic visions that Hollywood has produced, like Mad Max. I mean, they really see a real threat. If we proceed with business as usual and we lock in these changes that, as I alluded to, will create, in some sense, a fundamentally different planet. And one aspect of that planet will be much greater competition for decreased resources, food, water, and land, with sea level rise taking away, much of the currently inhabited coastlines.
Yes, Norm?
To what extent does reforestation contribute to global warming?
It is a contributor. There are these pie charts that you can find, for example, in the IPCC reports that show the contributions from various sectors of society. So a big chunk is fossil fuel burning for transportation and for energy, for power. But much of the remaining, between 16 and 25% of the emissions come from things like agriculture, come from deforestation, the forestry sector. So while the lion's share of the problem has to do with the burning of fossil fuels for energy and for transportation, there's a non-trivial component that does have to do with things like deforestation. And that's why, in part, the negotiations over how to mitigate climate change have become so complicated, because there are various ways to go after the problem, and for certain countries, for example, countries of the Amazon, perhaps the greatest contribution they can make is to limit the rate and extent of deforestation taking place in the Amazon right now that's contributing to global greenhouse emissions. In some regions, there's the potential to change land use practices in a way that actually allows the surface of the earth to take in more CO2. And just like reforestation can help take some of that CO2 out of the atmosphere, there are other changes and practices that can do that as well. And so there isn't, again, I sort of alluded to that, there isn't a magic bullet, also in the sense that it isn't all just fossil fuels. There are other things, and when you throw methane into the mix, there are issues like livestock and rice cultivation that also come in. And because the two gases have different time frames, it really starts to become a question of what are you trying to do? Are you trying to limit the long-term warming of the planet, the committed warming, in which case you focus a lot on CO2? Are we worried that we might pass a dangerous threshold of warming within the next decade or two where we start to trigger certain so-called tipping points? If that becomes a primary concern, then methane might be more of a player, because even though it has a shorter time frame, shorter time scale in the atmosphere, it's relevant to the warming that we might see over a time frame of a decade or 2 decades, and whether we'll cross some dangerous threshold on that time frame. So it's, there are these complexities when you look at the science and its implications. And there's a good faith debate because of that can be had about what policies we should put in place to deal with climate change. What's such a shame, what I think is such a shame, is that we're not having that good faith debate right now because we're still stuck in this bad faith debate, at least within the US, about whether the problem is even real.
We'll do one more for it. Is there anybody from the room over in the Babylon students at the Montauk room who has a question? No? No? Okay, so we'll do one more here. Yes.
If you were trying to sway someone's opinion on climate change, if they were a skeptic, what is the first thing that most important thing you would say?
Well, the first thing I would say is if they're really a skeptic, that they should engage in true skepticism, which is to say equal-sided skepticism. Many of those who call themselves skeptics, I wouldn't call them skeptics at all. I'd call them critics or cynics or contrarians or deniers, because they're often willing to call into question the consensus of the world scientists, the National Academy of Sciences, all the national academies of all the major industrial nations. They're willing to call all of that in 200 years nearly of science, contributions from scientists like Joseph Fourier in the early 19th century, they discovered the law of heat conduction. I mean, they're calling that sort of science into question based on the flimsiest of arguments that don't stand up to the slightest bit of scrutiny. So there's this disconnect between, somebody who's who's truly coming at, and some of those who don't accept the science, you'll sometimes find that just throwing facts at them won't dissuade them, or trying to explain the science won't dissuade them, because it turns out when you dig a little bit beneath the surface, it isn't so much the science that they're not accepting, but rather there's an ideology. They come at it from an ideological or political point of view. They think that regulation is bad, and if the science is real, it does imply the need to in some way regulate our carbon emissions. And so if that's anathema to you from an ideological or political point of view, then it may be convenient to pretend that the problem isn't real, because that's the only way you can justify that ideological position. And so sometimes you actually see it working in the opposite way that science is supposed to work. The science should inform policy. We should use the best science we have to give the best answers we can to our policymakers to make, appropriate decisions that weigh the risks, of different actions. But too often you see people going in the opposite direction. They start out with an ideology, and then they work backwards to find the quote-unquote science that they need to be able to justify that ideology. And science just doesn't work that way. You can't choose your facts. There is a set of objective facts. There's a famous New York congressman, Daniel P. Moynihan, who decades ago once famously said that you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. And in the climate change debate, increasingly we find people who seem to think that they're entitled to their own facts. We have a cable network that would be happy to throw facts at you that are completely at odds with what the world scientists are saying. And so, but a true skeptic, somebody who's open-minded and has been, and just hasn't, received the information, and I know we have to wrap it up, so this is what I would say. I would say, take your best talking points, take the top 10 things that they think contradict the reality of human-caused climate change, and see what the National Science Foundation has to say on their website, or see what the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration has to say on their website, or go to a website called Skeptical Science that is devoted in part to taking the various talking points that you hear from contrarians in the climate change debate and telling you what the science actually has to say. And it gives you sort of a beginning level, an intermediate level, and an advanced level response. So you can sort of choose, you calibrate the response you want, and it's downloadable as an app for your iPhone or your PDA. So.
You can also take my class. I'm offering it in the summer and next fall. So thank you very much, Dr. Mann. If you're interested, there are some books over here. The bookstore is here. Although Dr. Mann does have another appointment shortly after this. He'll stay around for a couple of minutes.